Aloha and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for our attendees who are here with us this afternoon in person and those that are joining us online this afternoon. I'd like to introduce and welcome you to our Research Speaker Series, the East West Center Research Speaker Series, which is a recurring program that spotlight emerging developments across the region. And through this series, we hope to explore environmental, demographic, political, as well as economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region in profound ways. This afternoon, we're very fortunate and grateful to have Mr. Kyle Stice, who's going to be presenting the Pacific Farmers Organization with us. And I'd like to introduce him. Kyle Stice is the co-founder and executive director of the Pacific Farm Organizations, a regional farm organization network with membership in 13 Pacific Island nations and a direct reach of 98,000 farmers. He has led numerous rural development and climate change adaptation programs across the Pacific, working through farmer organizations for the past 15 years in partnership with multiple global development partners. Kyle Stice, we're very grateful to have you with us this afternoon, and we look forward to learning more about the Pacific Farmers Organization. Please welcome.
Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in the room and online. It's really an honor to have this platform to be able to talk about these big issues: climate change, food security, and NCDs, and hopefully to present it from a slightly different perspective, and the perspective of farmers. So as Tammy said, my name is Kyle Stice. I'm an American Fijian. I'm actually a farmer by profession, and I've had the most amazing opportunity to work closely with farmers in almost all Pacific Island countries. So I'm going to be taking that perspective today and bringing this collective voice of our organization, which I've been involved with since inception in 2008. I remember the first time that I planted a garden on our family land in Fiji. And I remember being so proud that I could grow food and bringing it into the house, and it's that sense of accomplishment. And then about 10 years later, I was farming commercially and supplying a cooperative that was exporting papaya. And I remember I happened to be working at that cooperative as well. And I remember looking around at the 300 or so farmers that made up this cooperative and being amazed that altogether we could bring 1,300 tons of produce and export it out. Now, fast forward to today, when I'm up here sharing about the work of over 100,000 farmers in the Pacific that are feeding communities, that are bringing, responding to these challenges and bringing innovation. And there's so much more that can be done, but I hope that through my talk today, I will both inform and inspire those listening, that hopefully we can continue to work forward in this spirit of collective action, and not just collective action, but bringing appropriate solutions. So I'm going to start my my presentation here. Okay, so Pacific Island leaders are now collectively referring to our region as the Blue Pacific Continent. And it's an incredibly large and important region covering over 3 million square miles and over 10,000 islands. So there is indeed lots of blue, lots of water, as you can see on this map. But today my talk is not so much about the blue, although the ocean is very important, but my talk is more about the green, about the land. And even though this map, you can't see much green, I will be focusing on the things that come out of the land from these Pacific Island countries in this blue and green Pacific. So as we dive into some of the context, the FAO reports that 3/4 of Pacific population live in rural areas, and that agriculture is the main livelihood of the majority of this population, 70+%. And that of these rural farmers, approximately 95% of them are family farmers or small-scale farmers that are using only family labor in order to not only feed themselves, but to earn a livelihood. So this is the context from which we are talking. But before we go any further with data and statistics, it's important to remember who it is that we're talking about. We're not just talking about numbers. We're talking about Pacific brothers and sisters. We're talking about aunties and uncles from Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. These are the faces of the people that we are talking about. So I'm going to center my talk around what is I'm calling the threat nexus for Pacific Island people. So as you can see, I have rural people in the middle of this nexus. And remember, about 70% of these are farmers. So we have rural people or farmers in the center. And I have these 3 interrelated threats that are impacting these people as the primary concern. So remember, I'm not an economist or I'm not a politician. So these people might be thinking differently when you talk about a threat nexus. They would be analyzing this from a different perspective. But putting rural people at the center, putting farmers at the center, we're proposing that these 3 interrelated threats are of prime concern. So this kind of nexus thinking is really important for Pacific Island people because we face this web of interconnected threats. So as you can see, climate change, food security, and NCDs. So climate change disrupts traditional farming systems. Which affects food security, which contributes to NCDs and dietary changes. So it's important to think about the interrelation of these threats. But it's equally important to address these threats comprehensively by making sure that we integrate our efforts and integrate our policies and recognizing the interplay between these different threats. And our network of farmer organizations has been actively researching, discussing, and proposing a series of solutions over the last 10 years that we believe are important for addressing these threats. So I'm going to be presenting these solutions. And remember, this is a group of farmers. We're a group of farmers. So there's not going to be a whole lot of fancy diagrams or tables when I present these solutions, but instead these are Pacific solutions by Pacific people. So I'm going to propose to anchor our solutions for this nexus of threats on 4 main things. One is traditional crops, both staple food crops, fruits, and vegetables. The second part is on improved traditional agriculture. Thirdly, on local food systems and value chain development. And fourthly, on strengthening of local organizations to deliver local solutions. And hopefully throughout my talk, I'm going to be able to share with you some of the literature and science that supports these solutions. So these are these are the solutions that I'm going to be anchoring my presentation on today. But before I do that, I think it's important to explain a little bit about farmer organizations, because maybe not everybody is on the same page or has the same definition. Actually, farmer organizations are a bit of a rarity in the Pacific compared to other parts of the world. And one of the reasons for this is the colonial legacy and the fact that in most Pacific Island countries, agriculture extension, research, and even the marketing of agriculture products was dominated by government. And therefore, farmer organizations were really stifled. And this is especially compared to other parts of the world like Central America and Southeast Asia. But over the last 30 years, there's been a quiet revolution taking place where farmers are starting to respond with their own solutions and starting to work together to solve their problems. And a lot of this is in response to dwindling government resources being available, but also more and more complex issues. So we had a system that relied on governments to provide farmers with all of the solutions, but as the problems got bigger and government resources got smaller, that model was no longer effective. And so we have this rise of Pacific farmer organizations. But I guess it's important to talk a little bit about a definition here. So our definition of farmer organizations is a group of farmers or a group working for the benefit of farmers. In different Pacific Island countries, they could be registered as a cooperative or as an association or an incorporated society. And a lot of this has got to do with the different registration options or the legal options that are available to these groups of farmers for registration. But this is essentially what I'm talking about when I refer to farmer organizations. And farmer organizations are essential for tapping into traditional knowledge and innovation, for providing key services, for amplifying the voice of rural people, and finally, for bridging the gap and extending the reach of government and development partners. And I want to just share quickly about our regional network. So we are a membership-based network. Our members are farmer organizations in 13 Pacific Island countries and territories. Our membership is in Fiji, where we have our head office, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Samoa, Papua New Guinea, Cook Islands, as far west as Timor-Leste, New Caledonia, up in the North Pacific in RMI, Hawaii, Kiribati, and FSM. So currently we have 35 national farmer organizations, which bring together about 350 local farmer organizations with a total membership of over 98,000 farmers. And again, I want to make sure that we put a face to all of these numbers. So this is our group of farmer organizations. This is our family. These are representatives from each of those organizations at a recent meeting in Fiji. Okay, so back to our threat nexus. I'm going to take some time to explore each one of these, starting with climate change, and then I want to attempt to show some clear linkages back to the solutions that we presented. So what do we know about the likely impacts of climate change on agriculture in the Pacific? Remember, climate change impacts look different in different parts of the world, and they look different for different sectors. So I'm talking specifically about the likely impacts of climate change on agriculture in the Pacific. And for this discussion, I'd like to point out the leading reference, which is an SPC publication called Vulnerability of Pacific Island Agriculture and Forestry to Climate Change. Those of you who haven't seen this publication, I encourage you to get a hold of it, because it's the first comprehensive study on the impacts of climate change on agriculture. It involves 23 main authors over 2 years. I was a contributing author on this book, and it's actually a sister publication to a book on fisheries and climate change in the Pacific. But I'll summarize a little bit from this book about the key likely impacts of climate change on agriculture in the Pacific. And the first one is that climate change will increase the severity of impact. The severity of impact from climate change will increase over time. The second one is that extreme weather events will have the most impact. The third is that there's a significant threat posed by climate change and the impact on global staples, grains, and therefore the reliance on imported food and how it threatens our food security. And I'm going to be talking quite a bit about that one. The book also shows that Pacific Island staple crops are likely to be more resilient to climate change, and that strengthening the production and the processing of these staples will be a key element of adaptation efforts. So those are the big messages from the book. This is a lot of what climate change will look like. Natural disasters and becoming even more extreme. The occurrence of Category 5 cyclones across the Pacific over the last 10 years, devastating not only farms, but infrastructure and crippling economies. Another key message related to agriculture is that agriculture has to be climate, environmentally, and economically smart now and in the future. And there's really no other option for sustainable livelihoods in the Pacific. Remember, 70% of Pacific people earn their livelihood primarily from agriculture. I want to read this quote to you because I think it really summarizes so well this climate change and agriculture discussion in the Pacific. It says that climate change will likely impact agriculture by amplifying the pressure of the existing threats, particularly climate extremes, in indefinable ways. So one of the problems with current approaches is they tend to ignore the current threats and they focus on these ill-defined climate changes. But by enabling farmers to adapt to the climate extremes in the short and medium term, therefore future generations of farmers will be better placed to adapt to climate change. Again, the pragmatic approach, and I'm quoting from the book, is to improve the capacity to address existing threats while continuing to address knowledge gaps and identify future threats. So as we think about what might happen, as we forecast what temperature change, the impacts on these crops, we need to be helping farmers to adapt to the challenge they're facing now: pest, disease, drought, too much water. And by doing that, we're building their resilience for future threats. Okay, so now I'm moving on from talking about climate change to talking a little bit about food security. And one of the ways to talk about food security in the Pacific is through what's called a food import capability indicator. So this FICI basically is the ratio of food imports to total exports. And this is kind of a measure of a country's aggregate food security. So you can see the numbers there. Basically, the higher the number, the more food insecure the country is. Its ability to buy food and produce food. So you see in countries like Fiji, they have a moderate vulnerability, 0.7. Melanesian countries like Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands are very low. So they produce a majority of their food and their imports are quite low. But as we work through many of these other countries, including Samoa and Tonga, we see this FICI getting much higher. And in extreme cases of Kiribati, where the FICI indicator is 7.5. So this is a good indication of the level of food insecurity in a country. There's a very recent report that came out that provides some really in-depth data. So the Journal of Food Security, it has pulled together all of this import and export data. And we can see from this data over here that the dependence on food imports has increased dramatically from the mid-90s. In almost all cases, food exports has declined. So I understand there's a lot of data on this table, and I want to again point out this publication because it's very recent in the Global Food Security Journal. But it's showing in the orange lines, that's the period 2014 to 2018. And then in the blue lines, we have 1995 to 1999. And in almost all cases, we have seen that imports have increased substantially, and in most cases, exports have decreased. This is therefore contributing to the food insecurity in our countries. But looking at this data a little bit closer, we can see that the imports have increased across all of the food and beverage clusters, but the greatest overall increase occurs from cereals, dominated by rice and wheat. So we also see that import of meat and meat offal has almost doubled over this period. But I want to talk more about the rice and the wheat, because you can see in the graph there, which is also broken up by sub-region. We have Melanesia with a light blue dotted line, Polynesia with a dark blue dotted line, and Micronesia. We've seen that in almost all cases, these staples, in import of these staples shows that we have this dependence on importing in order to meet our domestic demand. So interesting from this data and related to our next threat is that the greatest relative increase in imports has occurred across processed and prepared foods. So in summary, our region is importing more and more rice, and we're importing more and more wheat, and we are importing more and more processed and prepared foods. So although this might be an alarming figure that we are importing so much, I think the relationship with climate change is even more important. So as we become even more dependent on staple crops that are imported, rice and wheat, we also increase our vulnerability to climate change significantly. Because what the literature is showing us is that a whole lot of our food security in the Pacific, in the region, is also related to what happens outside of the region. And so climate change and food security are really closely linked, and it has more to do with the impact of climate change in the countries that are producing these staple crops. And what the literature shows is that imported grains like rice and wheat, which comprise half of our imports, that they are going to be highly impacted by climate change. And we're already seeing this with the impact of the recent drought on wheat coming out of Australia. So ERI, which is the Institute for Rice Research, projects that a 1 degree increase in night temperatures leads to a 10-degree drop in rice yield. And with these grain crops, they require high amounts of purchased inputs. And a major constraint to maintaining this global grain production is the cost of fertilizer and fuel for mechanization. What does this mean for us in the Pacific Islands as we see becoming more and more dependent on rice and wheat? Our food security is dependent on those imports. That there's likely going to be a substantial increase in the real price of these imported grains, particularly rice. So let's unpack this a little bit. About 10%, less than 10% of rice produced is traded internationally. So increasing pressure on the available supply of internationally traded rice. So we're going to see that as pressure is put on rice production, that less is going to be available for international trade, and then therefore the price will go up. So International Food Policy Research Institute forecast by 2050 that rice prices will increase by 35% in real terms. And this has serious food implications for the Pacific Islands. As I shared, most of these families are now dependent on rice and wheat. Imagine families living off of $100 a week who are now going to buy their staple food, rice, and they are paying 35% more. So this has serious implications. So climate change on agriculture, these impacts are not just what's going to mean for farming in the Pacific, but what does it mean for farming globally? But it's not all bad news, because we see here that we have a comparative advantage. And this comparative advantage for the Pacific lies in shifting away from these imported staples towards traditional staple crops. And as the science is showing, climate change is expected to have much less of an impact on these traditional Pacific Island crops. And we see this for a number of reasons. These staple crops like sweet potato, taro, cassava, yams, these are very efficient converters of solar energy with their broad leaves and their ability to store in underground organs. So this gives traditional Pacific Island staples an increasing comparative advantage. This gives farmers a comparative advantage. As we see population pressure, increasing scarcity of arable land, fertilizer, and energy, we see that traditional staple crops emerge as a real comparative advantage to these imported staples. And amongst these imported staples is one of my favorite crops, which is breadfruit. And breadfruit in particular is very special for its ability to secure food energy from these large leaves and large canopy. And it's also very undemanding of soil. Across the Pacific, in most agroecological conditions, breadfruit can thrive. It has a high tolerance to climate extremes. It's one of the few big, deep-rooted trees that can be completely blown over and sprout back out again. It's very well suited to intercropping, which is the traditional farming system in the Pacific. Its potential sequestration role, and that it's high yielding in biomass, which can be converted to high quality gluten-free flour and paste products. Finally, I want to talk about the last interrelated threat. Last, but certainly not the least important, and this is NCDs, or non-communicable diseases, diabetes, heart disease, etc. So according to SPC publication this year, 75% of all deaths in the Pacific are attributable to NCDs, and most of these deaths are premature. And this SPC data is mostly drawn from the WHO NCD Progress Monitor, and I've got some of their data from 2022 over here. The probability of premature mortality from NCDs in Asia and the Pacific. And we see, according to this WHO report, 6 of the top 10 leading countries in the world for the probability of premature mortality from NCDs are in the Pacific, shown in those dark blue, with Kiribati at the top, FSM, followed by our Melanesian countries, Vanuatu, Solomons, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. So that same report indicates that the Pacific is experiencing a non-communicable disease epidemic, and it's largely driven by an ongoing nutrition transition from nutrient-rich whole foods to imported staples and highly processed foods. And this same data from the World Food Security Journal has actually broken down these imports according to 2 categories: the healthy food and the unhealthy food. Because of course, not all food imports are bad. And if you're a small country, being able to import food in order to address your food security challenges is very important. But what type of food are we importing? And so this data is aggregated according to healthy food and unhealthy food imports. And again, it's broken down by each sub-region. So on a per capita basis, Melanesia has seen a marginal decrease in the imports of healthy food, while Micronesia imports of healthy food has almost doubled. But in contrast, there's been this persistent and this steep increase in the net imports of unhealthy food. Both Micronesia and Polynesia currently import approximately 85 kilograms per capita per annum of unhealthy foods. And this is up from about 50 kilos per capita in the 1990s. So Melanesia imports less unhealthy food per capita basis, but it's steadily increasing. And these unhealthy foods and beverages that dominate the quantities, things like sugar, sweetened beverages, and these other caloric sweeteners. So as I mentioned, the Brewer report states that the Pacific region is experiencing this NCD epidemic, and it's largely driven by this transition from these nutrient-rich whole foods to these imported staples and the highly processed foods. So what are we doing as a region? There actually is a lot of work happening. There are big challenges, but the region is working on this. But the questions that we have to ask are, with all of this good work going on, is it enough? Are we meeting these needs? Do we have the right policy focus? Are we reaching the right people? And is it integrated? And I'm sure many of you are aware that our leaders have launched the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. And looking at the strategy and the different thematic areas and the commitments, we can definitely see that Pacific Island leaders are aware of these interrelated threats, and they are working to address these. We see a number of regional organizations investing in campaigns to address the NCD, the food security, the food production challenges. There are a lot of activities happening. I want to draw your attention particularly to the new way of thinking about this holistically, the food system framework. And this is drawn out from a new program within SPC that focuses on food systems and sees these interrelated impacts and therefore the interrelated responses. Also, we see the United States as making a new re-entry into the Pacific through USAID and the ongoing role of the US embassies and other missions in the Pacific. Looking at the strategy for the Pacific Islands through USAID, very recently the new mission has opened up in Suva. So we see that there are certainly a lot of efforts and they are all acknowledging that these issues are taking place. But what I'm proposing is that it's not enough that we work purely from the top down. It's not enough that we only talk to governments and work through government mechanisms to solve these problems. If the farmers are the most impacted by climate change, by food security, by NCDs, they're also the solution providers. They are the ones that are producing the food. And so therefore, through farmer organizations, I'm proposing that they are essential for tapping into the traditional knowledge and innovation that has sustained these island countries for thousands of years. Before there was this transition to these imported foods, before all of the NCDs began to kill such high proportions, these countries were producing food and it was healthy food. Also, farmer organizations are essential for providing key services. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we reach farmers in the past and how we are reaching farmers now. But also, that farmer organizations are important for amplifying the voice of rural people. It's great to be developing strategies and policies, but are the voice of the people actually coming through in those strategies and policies? Do government representatives really speak for all of the rural people, or is there ways to enhance those consultations and policy development through bringing the voice of the people up? And of course, for bridging the gap and extending the reach of government and development partners. So I've got a little diagram here to help depict what I'm talking about. The traditional approach, farmer organization of government and aid agencies, we see them working through farmer organizations to reach more and more farmers. So helping the investment to go further. Also, a little bit of a diagram that just shows how farmer organizations can improve the flow of information. So many policy development initiatives, they would like to get the voice of rural people, of farmers, but they can't go and talk to every farmer. But instead, being able to talk to leaders of farmer organizations, both at the local, national level, and then even through regional organizations like ours, helps to bring information up the channel, but also farmer organizations help to bring information back down. So governments have new policies or programs, but how many farmers know about them? Well, farmer organizations can be that conduit. So I just want to touch a little bit about how we work with farmers in the Pacific. And this really comes down to two parts. There's extension and there's research. So extension is how do we service or advise farmers? And then research is how do we explore the innovations or the solutions to the problems? So how do we do it? How good a job are we doing? And how are things evolving? So I talked about a little bit of our colonial legacy here. We see that the traditional model has has government working directly with farmers. But we see now that there's an emerging model that has farmer organizations as an important intermediary, being able to reach more and more farmers. Also, when it comes to agricultural research, our research was primarily done as centralized research. So each country has a few government research stations and they do the work and they hope that the farmers come and visit or take out the research papers. But we're seeing that a new model is emerging where localized, decentralized farms are doing on-farm research, which is much more accessible to farmers in the community. And through these farmers and these farmer organizations, we see an enormous amount of local solutions. These are our members engaging in these local solutions. Things like keyhole gardening in the Cook Islands, things like working through school canteens, the development of nurseries, working on agroforestry and innovative extension models like Tell a Woman program. We see virtual networks emerging to help farmers sell their products, and backyard gardening as a key initiative. So these are all local solutions by local people, farmer organizations, to address these big issues all across the region. At a regional level, we are focusing a lot of our attention around breadfruit as one of the key staple crops. So in 2022, we had a global breadfruit summit here in Hawaii. And then last month, we had a summit in the Cook Islands in Rarotonga. And this is about collaborating at a regional level to be able to share information and collectively work towards this goal. And of course, making our resources available virtually, because we know it's expensive to be able to share. And then one of my final messages is that farmer organizations connected regionally and globally greatly enhance these efforts. So I've got this diagram that basically shows how a farmer in Fiji could potentially be connected to a farmer in the Marshall Islands if they're connected to their local farmer organization, which is then connected at the regional level. And this kind of cooperation is essential for what we are trying to do. And we're very fortunate to see this quiet revolution taking place where the network of farmer organizations is growing significantly over the past decade. And as we grow in numbers, also people are listening, and we are getting more and more partnership opportunities from government and regional partners who are saying, yes, we want to support this development model, and it's allowing these farmer organizations to reach more and more. But built into all of this is the essential principle that we need as much resources to go to the ground level. We want to make sure that our development is not top heavy with lots of people sitting in offices and very little going down to the ground. And so our inbuilt model is that 90% of all of the resources need to go directly to the ground. So this is my final slide, and I sped up because I had a couple of signs in the back over there. But this is the call to action for farmers, for farmer organizations, for researchers, governments, development partners, that we need to prioritize traditional crops. Oh, I lost it here. Sorry. Sorry, I lost my slide here. That we need to prioritize traditional crops, staple crops, fruits, vegetables, that we need to value traditional agriculture practices and work to enhance them, that we need to invest in local food systems and invest in local value chain development. And we need to strengthen local organizations to be able to deliver these services. So thank you all for your time. I encourage you to check out pacificfarmers.com to hear about all of the work happening in the 14 countries. And also, if you're more interested in our breadfruit work, check out breadfruitpeople.com. And again, I'm thankful to the East-West Center to be able to share these perspectives from our farmer organizations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kyle, for sharing those insights, as well as sharing the work and experiences, but also the innovative solutions that the Pacific Farmers Organizations and the Pacific Islands people have towards addressing climate change impacts, as well as food security, and really minimizing non-communicable diseases, which we know is quite high in the region. And I know that that also stems across other regions that are focused on agriculture. I'm going to navigate my questions between those that are in the room and those that are online. So if you're online and if you have any questions, please post them under the Q&A chat. And but I will start first with our attendees in the room, if they have any question. And if you do have any question, there's a mic in front of you. You can just press the right corner of it. And then if you see the red light, you're good to go. So do we have any questions in the room? Okay, while you're thinking, let me start by asking one of the questions that's presented online. And I think you've covered it in your presentation, but they're asking, what are the most effective strategies for promoting healthy, locally produced agriculture and minimizing at the same time the temptation of importing unhealthy agricultural crops or food items, because it seems very difficult to influence people's dietary choices, particularly in this era.
Yeah, so certainly it is a complex issue, you know, especially when people are moving out and of the rural areas and having to buy food in town. Imported food is just cheaper. But as we see from the projections, that might not be the case for much longer. And if we can make help our farmers to take advantage of the opportunity presented with producing more local crops. And if we can engage in better value chain development, so this means making local crops as easy and as accessible as the bag of rice or the flour that we buy, then we're going to see that more and more people will be able to, engage with those local crops.
Thank you so much. I'll ask the room again if there's any question. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, hi. Sorry for missing the initial part of your presentation. I just want to ask, so one of the challenges that a lot of Pacific Island nations face is that large number of people are migrating out of the countries. So to what, how does this impact labor availability, because many of the traditional crops are also labor intensive. How does that impact labor availability, and how does that in turn have a bearing on the production and availability of these crops?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And thinking about the kinds of food systems that we develop in the Pacific, and the temptation to want to push big farms, maximize production, maximize mechanization. These are systems that are going to be very labor intensive. But if we look at the majority of the farms in the Pacific by number, these are small family farms. And this model is much more protected or shielded from these labor migrations than the larger commercial farms. So as governments, as development partners, what are we promoting? Are we promoting bigger farms that require a lot more labor, or are we promoting more traditional farming systems that work carefully with nature? So a lot of these labor inputs are going down. But I mean, it is a very important point. And many of our members are reflecting on the increasing challenges, especially those involved in export commodities. So these are the kinds of farms that are suffering from the loss of labor, people moving out, most recently from the Pacific Island Labor Scheme. But I believe that many of the smaller traditional farms are going to be shielded from that. So we hope that we can continue to support those farmers. We hear policy messages to the contrary in many of our countries, where the big focus is on production, commercialization, mechanization. This is the policy message that's being promoted, but actually all of the factors point in the other direction for long-term viability.
Thank you. And I'm going to just get one of the questions online, which kind of builds on the policy conversation that you just had. And this question focuses on farmers in Hawaii who are unable to keep up with the cost of living as well as maintaining their careers as farmers. Do you have any suggestions for policymakers to make farming more economically viable, as well as access to healthcare and everyday expenses, particularly within the farmers' community?
It's a very big question, but I think essentially when I shared that call to action about prioritizing local crops, about prioritizing local food systems, I was talking about everybody, including consumers and retailers and restaurants. And so part of the issue here in Hawaii and in many of our Pacific Islands is that, people are price takers. They're really buying what they can afford. And so being able to collectively work towards supporting these local food systems at all levels, I think is a big part of the solution. Maybe I can't comment too much on the specific costs of production and access to land. Those are all huge problems, not only in Hawaii, but in other parts of the world. But I think the big takeaway is to bring some alignment around what a vibrant Pacific Island region looks like. And that is one that is promoting traditional crops, that's promoting local food systems, that's promoting our local farming systems. And this is what we hope to get not only farmers and governments, but also consumers thinking about.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, awesome presentation, I like that. What I'm wanted to ask is that, mostly you talk about farm products. Does any initiative in the animal, production and integrating with, when you say farm, mostly you just take growing, but how about some livestock? So any fishing or animal products in the Pacific Islands?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So a lot of my talk did center around crops, but almost all of the family farmers, the 70% that I'm talking about, are involved in more traditional farming system, which means that they are growing crops and raising animals. Maybe these livestock systems don't find their products in the supermarkets, which is mostly imported meats, but it does go a long ways to supporting local consumption, especially for cultural functions and things like that. So livestock and animal rearing provides a very important role for food security, for helping with eating more healthy meats, as opposed to some of the figures that I showed. Those are meat offals. These are processed meat. These are coming in cans full of salt and other processed products. So definitely these integrated farming systems that provide the family with what they need, as well as the local community, even if they don't feed into the supermarkets, are really important.
I have a question online that I wanted to know your thoughts on the implication of Chinese and American farm policies and how they affect the promotion, but also the production of local crops, particularly breadfruit or other agricultural crops within the region.
Certainly, there's no other region that is more fragile from an environmental ecosystem point of view than these small Pacific Islands. And farming practices that are heavily dependent on inputs, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, are going to have a much more detrimental impact in these small island ecosystems than they do in places like with large land masses. So certainly, we hope that these development partners would be talking to farmers, would be looking at traditional farming systems, what has worked for the last 2,000 years, instead of just bringing a cut and paste solution that says, hey, this is how farming has solved problems in Africa, or how farming has solved problems in Southeast Asia, but instead looking to see what are the Pacific farmers doing and how can we work to improve that, because there is a place for science and modern agriculture, but it needs to enhance these traditional farming systems instead of replacing that. And I think the question is quite valid, because we do see demonstration sites all over the Pacific that are promoting a different kind of farming, and a farming that is dependent on the importation and use of agri-chemicals, many of which are not good for the environment, not good for the farmer, and not good for the consumer.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, one more friend, Kyle. When you talk about education, like, when we're younger, growing up in a rural area, they have organizations like 4-H clubs. You start learning about agriculture at a young age. Is the farm organization bringing education into the local community?
Yeah, what a great question. And I'm looking out to the crowd over here, and I see my colleague Dennis Chase from the Hawaii Farm to School Hui. And I think there are so many great initiatives that are making sure that we connect young people to the food that they eat, whether it's growing it or consuming it, and especially if we can connect them to the local foods. And we would like to be able to scale up more of these initiatives. And I think Hawaii provides a really great model that is replicable in many of the other Pacific Island countries, because it needs to start when people are young, having a connection to the food, having a passion for growing it, and knowing how to eat and enjoy and love these traditional crops. And as you said, many of the older generation do, but are we sustaining that for this new generation?
Thank you. And maybe just a closing question, just based on that, how do you think the Pacific Farmers Organizations as well as other food organizations can encourage young people to be more engaged in farming or agricultural activities, considering that it's not really an ideal career path for the young generation today?
Yeah, we sort of have this amazing opportunity, which is to look at the 14 countries where we're working, look at the models, the solutions that they are applying, and then to be able to support those. So basically, I can't give you a direct answer to that because it really all depends on the different countries. It depends on the size of the agriculture economy there. It depends on the variables. But I will say that there are a lot of great models that are out there. And this is why I'm so thankful to be able to stand in front of an audience like this and to have this platform, is to be able to put the spotlight on these local solutions and put the spotlight on these local organizations. So hopefully they get more attention. And if you invite these farmers through their farmer organizations to the planning, I guarantee that you will have a much greater input and many more solutions that we can work together with the development partners and government to address these issues.
Thank you so much, Carl, for your time and for sharing those insights.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say thank you again, once again, to Kyle for taking his time to share with us the knowledge as well as the work and experiences of farmers in the Pacific Island region, and to really inform the conversations that we've been having on the importance of agriculture, but also that nexus between climate change, food security, and non-communicable diseases, and what would food security look like in the future. So thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you for coming today, all of you who are here in person and in the room. And I would like to extend many thanks as well to our attendees who are online. Thank you very much for joining us from across the Pacific, but also across the globe. Our next research speaker series will be on October 11th, 2023. And it's going to be from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Honolulu time. It's going to be hosted virtually, so please feel free to join in. Our speaker will be Dr. Jung-Ho Beck, and the topic of the talk will be a new look at the crude oil shocks and Korea's bilateral trade. So with that, I would like to thank all of you again, and thank you for coming and joining us in today's research speaker series. Mahalo.